While American soldiers died fighting Nazis on the beaches of Normandy, the US government was paying German prisoners 80 cents a day to pick cotton in Texas, and some of them were saving enough money to buy their way back to America after the war. This is the story of how the enemy became employees, and how following the rules of war created one of World War II's most outrageous contradictions. September 23, 1943, Hearne, Texas. The sun hadn't yet broken over Robertson County when the trucks began rolling out. Inside each canvas-covered bed sat 20 to 30 men in faded blue uniforms, their jackets stenciled with large PW letters in white paint. They weren't American soldiers. They were German prisoners of war, and they were going to work. As the convoy turned onto Farm Road 485, the men could see it stretching before them like an ocean, endless rows of white bowls ready for harvest, the cotton plants heavy with the crop that kept Texas rich. For most of these Germans, many of whom had never seen anything like the vast flatness of central Texas, the sight was almost otherworldly. Just months ago, they'd been fighting in North Africa under Rommel's Afrika Korps. Now they were about to pick cotton for 80 cents a day. The guard sitting at the tailgate, a 47-year-old corporal named Chester Williams, who'd been deemed too old for combat duty, lit a cigarette and watched the Germans with a mixture of resentment and boredom. His own son was somewhere in Italy, with the 36th Infantry Division. These men might have shot at him. And here he was, making sure they got to work on time and got paid for it. It was one of World War II's strangest contradictions, one that would spark outrage, confusion, and debate across America. While American boys died fighting Nazis on foreign soil, the United States government was paying German prisoners to harvest America's crops, sleep in comfortable barracks, and live better than many American citizens. This is the story of how the enemy became employees, how the Geneva Convention created a peculiar kind of justice, and how Texas cotton fields became an unlikely stage for one of the war's most bizarre chapters. The flood begins. The German prisoners started arriving in Texas in late 1942, but the real flood began after the fall of Tunisia in May 1943, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's once mighty Afrika Korps finally collapsed. Under the combined weight of British and American forces, nearly 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. The problem was immediate and massive. What do you do with 250,000 enemy prisoners? Britain, already straining under food rationing and the constant threat of German bombing, couldn't handle them. The solution was to ship them across the Atlantic to the United States, where they'd be far from any possible rescue, unable to escape back to Germany, and potentially useful in addressing America's growing labor shortage. Major General Archer L. Lurch, the Provost Marshal General overseeing the enemy POW Information Bureau in Washington, faced a logistical nightmare. The United States had never handled prisoners on this scale. During World War I, the country had held only about 2,300 German POWs. Now, by the end of 1943, that number would exceed 150,000, and it would eventually reach over 425,000 by war's end. Texas, with its vast open spaces, mild climate, and desperate need for agricultural labor, became a primary destination. The state would eventually host more than 50,000 German prisoners across dozens of camps scattered from the Panhandle to the Gulf Coast. The largest of these was Camp Huntsville, which could hold 3,000 men. Others dotted the map: Camp Swift near Austin, Camp Fannin in Tyler, Camp Walters near Mineral Wells, and Camp Howes in Gainesville. Dozens of smaller branch camps, often just collections of tents or hastily built barracks, sprouted near cotton fields, farms, and canning facilities, wherever the labor was needed most. But the most controversial aspect wasn't where they were held or how many there were. It was what they were paid. 80 cents a day. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had signed and was bound to honor, was explicit in its requirements. Article 34 stated that prisoners of war could be required to work, but not at labor directly related to the war effort. Article 30 specified that prisoners would be paid a fair working rate of pay. The U.S. Army interpreted this to mean that POWs should receive the same base pay as American soldiers performing similar duties. For enlisted men, that meant 80 cents per day, Officers could not be compelled to work per the convention, though many volunteered. The payment came in the form of canteen coupons that could be spent at the camp store, where prisoners could buy cigarettes, beer, candy, toiletries, writing materials, and even musical instruments. To Americans struggling with rationing, sending sons to war, and working long hours in defense plants, the idea of paying enemy soldiers seemed absurd. To the German prisoners themselves, it seemed miraculous. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a 24-year-old former tank crewman from Bavaria who'd been captured near Kasserine Pass, wrote to his family in a letter that made it past camp censors in October 1943. "I know you won't believe this, but they pay us to work. Real money we can spend. Yesterday I bought chocolate, real chocolate mama, and American cigarettes. We eat 3 times a day, more food than I saw in the last year in Africa. Some of the men are actually gaining weight. If this is prison, I wonder what they'd call freedom." The letter, preserved in the National Archives, captured the surreal reality of POW life in America. These men, ideologically indoctrinated to believe in American decadence and weakness, instead found a country of almost unimaginable abundance. The cotton economy. Texas farmers were desperate. By 1943, the state's agricultural workforce had been decimated. Young men who would normally be bringing in the cotton harvest were instead fighting in Europe and the Pacific. The 1943 cotton crop was one of the largest on record, nearly 3 million bales in Texas alone. But without workers to pick it, the crop would rot in the fields. The going rate for cotton picking was about $3 per 100 pounds picked. A good worker could pick 200–300 pounds per day, meaning $6 to $6.9 in wages. The federal government charged farmers $4.50 per prisoner per day, which covered the cost of guards, transportation, and food. The prisoner himself got his 80 cents. The rest went to the U.S. Treasury to offset the cost of running the POW program. For farmers, it was a bargain. For the local economy, it was a lifeline. A report from the Texas Agricultural Extension Service in November 1943 estimated that German POW labor saved that year's cotton harvest across 47 counties, preventing economic losses that would have exceeded $23 million worth, roughly $400 million in today's dollars. But the arrangement created strange scenes across rural Texas. In towns like Hearne, Brownwood, Mexia, and Amarillo, residents grew accustomed to seeing groups of German prisoners working alongside the remaining civilian laborers, often singing German marching songs as they moved down the rows. Guards, usually older men or those with medical exemptions from combat duty, stood watch with rifles, though escape attempts were remarkably rare. Where would they go? They were thousands of miles from Germany, in the middle of Texas, where their accents and language made them instantly identifiable. Most prisoners recognized their situation for what it was, vastly preferable to the alternative of a POW camp in Soviet Russia, or continued fighting in a war many were beginning to realize Germany would lose. Hearne, located about 15 miles from Texas A&M University, offers a window into daily POW life. Constructed in the summer of 1942, it was designed to hold 4,800 prisoners. By late 1943, it housed nearly 5,000 men in tar paper barracks arranged in neat rows, surrounded by double barbed wire fences and guard towers. Inside, however, the camp was anything but grim. The prisoners, using their canteen wages and their own labor during off hours, had transformed the compound into a remarkably civilized community. They built a theater that could seat 1,000 people, where they performed German plays and concerts. They constructed a chapel. They created a library with over 10,000 books, many ordered through the YMCA War Prisoners Aid Program. They formed soccer teams, orchestras, art classes, and even a camp newspaper called Der Zaungast, the Fence Guest. Lieutenant Colonel William T. Carpenter, who commanded Camp Hearne from 1943 to 1945, kept detailed records now housed at Texas A&M University. His reports reveal the strange duality of his position. He was both jailer and host, required to keep enemy soldiers secure, while also ensuring they were treated according to international law. In a report dated January 15, 1944, Carpenter wrote, "The prisoners maintain exceptional discipline and order. Their barracks are kept cleaner than most army installations I've inspected. They've constructed gardens, including one quite elaborate rock garden with a fountain. Yesterday I observed a string quartet practicing Beethoven. It's easy to forget these are enemy combatants. Then I received the weekly casualty list from Europe, and remember that men like these are killing American soldiers. The canteen system created a thriving internal economy. Prisoners who worked earned coupons. Those who didn't work, officers, the injured, those who refused, had to rely on the standard issue or trade for what they wanted. Skilled tradesmen could earn extra by providing services, haircuts, tailoring, art lessons, or English tutoring. Learning English became hugely popular as prisoners contemplated post-war possibilities. The Camp Swift canteen, in its peak month of August 1944, sold merchandise worth $12,000 in coupons, equivalent to roughly $200,000 today. The inventory lists from the National Personnel Records Center show the range of items available: Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, razor blades, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, pencils, harmonicas, playing cards, chess sets, and perhaps most notably beer. Each prisoner was allowed 2 bottles of 3.2% beer per day, which they could purchase with their wages. This detail, that German prisoners could buy and drink beer in American POW camps while American counties across Texas remained dry due to prohibition laws, caused particular consternation among local populations. The paradox of Jim Crow. Nowhere was the strangeness of the POW system more apparent than in its intersection with America's racial segregation. In Texas and across the South, German prisoners existed in a bizarre racial limbo that exposed the cruel absurdities of Jim Crow. African-American soldiers assigned to guard duty at POW camps witnessed the contradiction firsthand. They guarded white German prisoners who, when transported through towns for work assignments, could eat at whites-only restaurants while their black American guards could not. German POWs could use white bathrooms and water fountains. Some towns allowed German prisoners to attend movies in the white section, while black Americans sat in the balcony or separate section. Corporal William Dabney, a black guard at Camp Mexia, later recalled in an oral history recorded by the Veterans History Project in 1998, "We'd march them to the train station, these Nazi prisoners, and they'd walk right into the white waiting room while we had to use the colored entrance. I was wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army, and I had less freedom in my own country than the enemy. You think about that too long, it makes you crazy." The irony extended to the labor market. German prisoners, working in the cotton fields for 80 cents a day paid in coupons, were actually earning less than black sharecroppers and day laborers. But the prisoners also received free housing, 3 meals a day, medical care, and recreational facilities. When the full package was calculated, the German POW's standard of living often exceeded that of poor black Texans, and sometimes poor white Texans as well. This created resentment across racial lines. Some white farmers preferred the reliable, organized POW labor to hiring local workers. The prisoners showed up on time, worked in disciplined teams, and didn't talk back. A farmer who contracted for 20 POWs knew he'd get 20 workers. The same couldn't always be said for civilian labor in the chaotic wartime economy. Resistance and cooperation. Not all prisoners embraced their situation with gratitude. Among the POWs were committed Nazis who saw cooperation as betrayal. The camps developed internal tensions between the whites, anti-Nazi or simply pragmatic prisoners willing to work and accept their situation, and the blacks, ardent Nazis who maintained military discipline and ideological purity. At Camp Hearn, this tension erupted in violence. On the night of December 23, 1943, Corporal Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by fellow prisoners who accused him of being an informant. The murder shocked camp officials and led to a secret trial. 5 German POWs were eventually convicted. 2 were hanged at Fort Leavenworth in July 1945. The incident revealed the complicated dynamics within the camps. Despite the comfortable conditions and fair treatment, many prisoners remained loyal to Nazi ideology. Some saw their comfortable imprisonment as temporary, believing Germany would still win the war. Others used their wages to support the underground Nazi hierarchy that existed in many camps, where officers still commanded enlisted men. Nazi Party members maintained organizational structures, and courts-martial were held in secret. Captain Robert L. Kunzig, who served as a liaison officer between POW camps and the War Department, wrote in a classified memo dated March 3, 1944, "We are feeding, housing, and paying men who would kill our soldiers without hesitation if freed. Yet we must continue to do so. The Geneva Convention protects them, and our compliance ensures our own prisoners receive similar treatment. It's a devil's bargain, but a necessary one. Still, the vast majority of prisoners worked without incident. Escape attempts were rare. Fewer than 1% of prisoners ever tried, and most of those were recaptured within days. The most famous escape from a Texas camp occurred at Camp Huntsville in March 1944, when 7 prisoners disappeared during a work detail. 6 were caught within a week. The 7th, a submariner named Georg Gartner, would evade capture for 7 years, eventually turning himself in 1951 and becoming a U.S. citizen. The wealth accumulation. What made the POW work program particularly galling to some Americans was that many prisoners were saving money they could potentially take back to Germany after the war. While prisoners spent their 80 cents daily wage on immediate comforts, they could also deposit earnings into individual accounts managed by the army. Some prisoners, working steadily for 2 or 3 years, accumulated substantial sums. Records from the Provost Marshal General's office show that by war's end, some long-term POWs had accounts exceeding $500, worth about $8,500 today. Obergefreiter Fritz Engelmann, a prisoner at Camp Bowie near Brownwood, kept meticulous records of his earnings and expenditures from August 1943 to May 1946. His ledger, preserved in a collection donated to the German Texan Heritage Society, shows he earned a total of $742 over 34 months, spent $380 on canteen purchases, and saved $350. His notations include plans for what he'd do with the money, perhaps buy a camera, or save for the boat passage to America, if they'll let me return. Many prisoners harbored exactly this hope. Despite being enemies, despite the war, many German POWs fell in love with America. They experienced a level of freedom, abundance, and opportunity most had never known. They saw farms that stretched for miles, stores stocked with goods, and ordinary people living in comfort that would have been considered luxury in Germany. Some prisoners struck up friendships with local civilians, despite regulations limiting such fraternization. In small towns, where the same groups of prisoners worked the same farms week after week, relationships developed. Farmers' wives would sometimes bring extra food. Children, curious about the exotic foreigners, would wave and try to practice their limited German. A letter from Mary Henderson, a farmer's wife near Amarillo, to her sister in Oklahoma, dated November 7, 1944, captures this complex dynamic. We have 12 German boys working the back 40. They're polite hard workers. Yesterday one of them, Hans I think his name is, fixed our tractor that's been giving Robert fits for weeks. He wouldn't take anything extra for it, just smiled and said danke for the lemonade I brought out. It's the strangest thing, Helen. My boy Tommy is overseas fighting Germans, and here I am feeling grateful to these Germans for saving our harvest. How do you make sense of that? The economics of paradox. By 1945, the POW labor program had become essential to the American agricultural economy. Across the United States, over 425,000 German and Italian POWs were working in fields, canneries, lumber camps, and food processing plants. In Texas alone, during the peak harvest season of 1945, over 35,000 German POWs were working in agriculture. The financial arrangements created a bizarre circular economy. The U.S. government spent approximately $300 million annually to house, feed, guard, and manage POW camps. Farmers and businesses paid the government for prisoner labor, offsetting about 40% of those costs. The prisoners themselves earned wages that they spent at government-run canteens, meaning much of the money simply circulated within the system. War Department analysis from February 1945 calculated that the POW labor program generated $230 million in economic value in 1944 alone, while costing $183 million to operate, a net positive. But these numbers didn't account for the political cost. American public resentment. Newspaper editorials across the country questioned the morality of the arrangement. The Dallas Morning News ran a piece on April 18, 1944, titled "Paying the Enemy," that captured the prevailing anger. While our sons bleed on foreign shores, We write paychecks to Nazi prisoners who sleep in comfort and eat their fill. The Geneva Convention may require we treat them humanely, but must we treat them better than our own citizens? Congressman Martin Dies Jr., representing Texas's 2nd District and chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, raised the issue in Congress on May 22, 1944. I have constituents who cannot understand why German prisoners eat white bread while Americans make do with wheat substitutes. Why prisoners drink Coca-Cola while sugar is rationed. Why they earn wages while American families scrape by on military allotments. The War Department must answer these questions. The War Department's response, delivered by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson on June 3, 1944, was pragmatic. We treat enemy prisoners according to international law because we have hundreds of thousands of American prisoners in German and Japanese hands. Every violation of the Geneva Convention we commit invites retaliation against our own men. Furthermore, the labor these prisoners provide is essential to our agricultural economy, and thus to the war effort itself. It is an imperfect system, but it serves our national interest. The human stories. Beyond the statistics and policy debates were individual human beings, both prisoners and guards, living through a strange chapter of history. Private Ernst Frömgen, a 19-year-old from Hamburg, captured in Tunisia, wrote a series of letters home that his daughter later donated to the Library of Congress. In a letter dated August 30, 1944, he described his experience picking cotton near Waco. The work is hard. Papa, my hands bled for the first week until calluses formed, but the American guard, they call him Sarge, showed me how to pull the bowls without tearing my fingers on the sharp pods. At lunch, we sit in the shade of the trucks, and they give us cold water and sandwiches. Sandwiches, Papa, with meat and cheese. Every day. Yesterday it was so hot that Sarge let us stop early and bought us all Coca-Colas from his own money. I think of you working in the factory on reduced rations, and I feel guilty for being so well fed. The guilt Frömgen expressed was common among prisoners, particularly as news from Germany grew worse. By late 1944, prisoners in Texas camps were receiving letters from home, describing Allied bombing, food shortages, and the Soviet advance from the east. Some prisoners stopped receiving letters altogether, as their hometowns were overrun or destroyed. Yet they continued to pick cotton, to attend camp concerts, to buy chocolate with their wages. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They were living in relative comfort, while their families starved and their comrades died. Some prisoners requested to work longer hours, as if through extra labor they could somehow earn the right to their good fortune. The guards experienced their own emotional complexities. Sergeant Thomas Rivera, a Mexican-American soldier from San Antonio assigned to Camp Swift, kept a diary throughout 1944 and 1945. His entry from December 16, 1944, reads, "Got word today that my cousin Eddie was killed in Belgium. Same day I'm supervising Krauts stringing Christmas lights in their rec hall, laughing and singing carols. I wanted to hate them. Should hate them. But these aren't the men who killed Eddie. They're just kids mostly. One of them, can't be more than 18, showed me a photo of his little brother. Looks just like my nephew. This war makes you hate, and it makes you tired of hating, all at the same time." The end and after. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the prisoners in Texas camps reacted with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The war was over, but what came next? Under international law, prisoners were supposed to be repatriated as soon as practical, after hostilities ended. But practical proved complicated. Europe was in ruins. Transportation was needed for American troops coming home. Food was scarce in Germany. Feeding returning POWs would strain the system. And American farmers still needed labor, perhaps more than ever, as they tried to meet production demands for feeding occupied Europe. So the prisoners stayed, and kept working, and kept earning their 80 cents a day. The last German POWs didn't leave American camps until 1946. Some left reluctantly, having grown accustomed to American life. A few, like Georg Gärtner, tried to stay illegally. Others vowed to return legally someday. Remarkably, hundreds did return. In the 1950s and 1960s, former POWs emigrated to the United States. Many settling in Texas, they used their savings, their memories of opportunity. And they're still decent English to start new lives. Some became farmers themselves, working the same fields they'd once picked as prisoners. Others opened businesses or brought specialized skills to their new home. The town of Herne maintains a small museum dedicated to Camp Herne, featuring artifacts left by prisoners, a hand-carved chess set, paintings of the Texas landscape, a violin repaired with materials from the camp workshop. Visitors often include elderly German men returning to see the place where they spent the war and where they first fell in love with America. The legacy. The story of German POWs earning wages in Texas cotton fields reveals the complicated nature of war and the unexpected consequences of international law. The Geneva Convention, designed to ensure humane treatment, created a situation where enemy soldiers lived better than many American citizens. Economic necessity transformed prisoners into essential workers, and the American ideals of fairness and abundance, even when extended to enemies, became a powerful form of soft power that won hearts decades. Before the term existed, the program cost the United States approximately $500 million over its duration. The labor provided by POWs was worth an estimated $700 million, but the true value was harder to calculate. Thousands of German soldiers returned home with stories of American decency, fairness, and prosperity. In the Cold War years that followed, when winning hearts and minds became crucial, these former POWs often became advocates for American values in Germany. The paradox remains: America's faithful adherence to the Geneva Convention, even when it seemed to benefit enemies more than citizens, demonstrated exactly the principles that differentiated democratic nations from fascist ones. The prisoners earned their 80 cents a day, but America earned something more valuable: proof that even in war, even toward enemies, it would honor its commitments and maintain its values. Walking through what remains of the old POW camps today, mostly just concrete foundations and the occasional rusting fence post, it's hard to imagine the scenes that played out there. The blue-uniformed prisoners lining up for work details, the camp canteens doing brisk business in chocolate and cigarettes, the theaters where Goethe was performed in German to audiences of homesick soldiers, the cotton fields where enemies became employees and where some glimpsed a future they'd fight to return to. The guards who resented paying enemies while their sons fought overseas weren't wrong. The prisoners who felt guilty eating well while their families starved weren't wrong. The farmers who needed the labor to survive weren't wrong. And the policymakers who insisted on following international law weren't wrong. They were all participants in one of World War II's strangest contradictions, a program where doing the right thing felt wrong, where justice seemed unjust, and where 80 cents a day bought more than chocolate and beer. It brought a glimpse of what peace might look like. Even in the middle of war, in the final accounting, perhaps that was worth the price.